I'm lonesome and blue, but when I look at you, there's one thing I know is true. I wouldn't be lonesome, I wouldn't be blue, if I had a girl like you.
A dazzling whirl of elegance, of exotic, extravagant beauties. An adventurous journey into the devastating allure of the most sophisticated women and their intimate secrets.
Welcome to a No Idols, No Masters podcast exclusive just for YouTube, Down the Demimonde. I'm Desi, your loyal liaison through the lore, lace, and long shadow of womanhood in a world that's always tried to dress us up, write us off, and write us out. Since the sun has risen on human civilization, the bodies of women and children, and occasionally men, have been treated as property, currency, and status symbols within patriarchy systems that tied sexual access to power, honor, lineage, and labor across the globe through every age. Sex, marriage, and servitude have intersected in ways that blurred the lines between consent and coercion. The courtesan, the concubine, the mistress, the prostitute, words that flutter between sex and status, society and scandal. They are vaguely similar and rarely interchangeable, but they all belong to a specific lineage: women, traded, desired, objectified, stigmatized, and historically ostracized. Whether in the state-controlled brothels of ancient Sumer and Rome, the sacred temples of India, Japan's floating world of the Edo period, or the back alley brothels of 19th century London. Sex work, both voluntary and forced, has always existed in a spectrum of visibility, legality, and social meaning. Unlike wives, who were often bound by duty and law, these women existed outside the legal and moral structures of their time. But unlike prostitutes in the street or tucked away in brothel boudoirs, courtesans, concubines, and mistresses often moved through elite circles, sometimes influencing kings, culture, and empires. Their worth was not tied to just their beauty or sexuality, but to how well they could play the game: seduction, performance, loyalty, secrets. Their roles offered moments of agency amid systemic oppression, but for most, exploitation was neither gilded nor poetic. It was grueling, violent, and generational. Holy matrimony, or marriage as we know it, often mirrored the transactional dynamics of slavery and sex work. Brides were bought, traded, and married off as children. Dowries were paid like taxes. Lineage and land preserved by controlling women's bodies. In some cultures, women's virginity was her only value, while in others, her fertility, obedience, or erotic skill became her currency. A mistress might be more desired and thus more favored over a legal wife. A concubine might bear an emperor's heir. The lines between prostitute, entertainer, wife, and slave were always shifting and always political. In Renaissance Italy, courtesans could be the intellectual equals of noblemen. In Imperial China, concubines lived in gilded cages under strict hierarchy. In France, royal mistresses sometimes held more power than queens. So when we talk about the oldest profession, we're really talking about a whole architecture of desire, control, and survival, a system that exists wherever patriarchy intersects with capital. And of course, these roles were not the same across the globe. Every culture, every era, shaping them differently, based on class, race, empire, and religion. What was sacred in one place was sinful in another. What was praised in a poem in Japan was punished by law in Britain. What connects them is this: the body, beauty, and labor of women and girls became currency. And those same individuals learned to either make a life or a legend from it. The oldest profession known to man has always adapted to customs, economies, and hypocrisies of its time. In some societies, sex workers were taxed, registered, and policed. In others, they were revered as priestesses or condemned as outcasts. In many, they were hidden in plain sight, serving emperors, feeding armies, birthing children, and vanishing into the margins. In this first installment, we dive deep. Not into one culture or time period, but across seas, mountains, and ruins, to highlight a global pattern of patriarchy's commodification of the feminine form. In Sumer's great temple Uruk, women known as Ereshtinger ladies of the god, managed estates, sang hymns, and danced in the flickering torchlight. Classical writers later claimed they also offered ritual sex to the worshippers of goddess Inanna. But some modern archaeologists debate whether that was ever part of the ceremony, or if it was a Hellenistic misunderstanding projected backward on to Mesopotamia. But considering that many civilizations, especially before monotheism, practiced the ritual act of sacred prostitution, we'll be doing a separate standalone episode in this series all about sacred prostitution. But what is clear, these women occupied a unique liminal space, neither wife nor common prostitute, neither fully free nor wholly enslaved. They remind us that the lines between piety, politics, and pleasure have always been entangled in a messy ménage à trois. In ancient Greece, hierarchies of desire and control were prevalent. Legalized prostitution was widespread in Athens, but typically restricted to non-citizen women, often slaves or medics, foreign residents without citizen rights. Citizenship came with both privilege and exclusion. Athenian women were considered to be too respectable to be public sexual beings. The heterae, meaning companions, were elite courtesans, educated, witty, and trained in the arts. Unlike common streetwalkers, called the pornai, heterae often mingled with philosophers and politicians. While they were still denied formal citizenship, they lived more freely than the sequestered wives of citizen men, many of which were kept out of public life and married for social alliances, not affection. The Greek marketplace for sexual services, especially in the bustling hubs like Athens and Corinth, were deeply intertwined with human trafficking. Enslaved women and children, many foreign-born were trafficked into brothels or sold as companions. Male sex work was also normalized. Pederastic relationships between older men and adolescent boys, often only teenagers, were framed as educational and erotic mentorships. These ties often blurred the line between mentorship and outright exploitation. While sexual identity wasn't categorized the way it is today, boys and young men were often commodified for the sexual pleasure of their elders. In ancient Rome, law, lineage, and public femininity was systemically controlled. Rome, ironically, prided itself on a monogamous marriage system, in contrast to the polygynous traditions of other ancient cultures. But this did not prevent the rise of concubinage, which became a legal and socially acceptable alternative to formal marriage. The concubina, or concubine, was often of lower social status, a freed woman, former slave, or foreigner. Though she lacked the status of a wife, she could live openly with a male partner and even be buried beside him. Roman law forbade a man from having both a legal wife and a concubine at the same time, though this wasn't always enforced. Roman girls could legally become betrothed as young as 12 years old, which was also the same age that non-resident girls could enter concubinage. Concubinage often served as a workaround to inheritance laws or class-based marriage restrictions, especially if a senator wanted to avoid marrying below his rank. In contrast to Greek seclusion, Roman women, especially elite ones, had a more visible public role, dining with men and hosting salons. Yet, this visibility did not equal autonomy. Female virtue was policed by law and custom, and respectability came with heavy surveillance. Like the Greeks, Romans commodified both male and female bodies. Brothels were state-regulated and taxed. Graffiti in Pompeii and legal ledgers confirm the prevalence of male and female sex workers. Male courtesans and bathhouse harlots serving both men and women were a fixture of urban Roman life. In both Greece and Rome, marriage functioned as a transaction, a way to secure alliances, produce heirs, and manage wealth. Love was rarely the goal. Women, especially of elite class, were married off young and expected to bear children while remaining sexually and socially obedient. Meanwhile, sex work occupied a paradoxical space, simultaneously condemned and essential. It offered moments of agency for some women, particularly the heterae and concubina, but far more often reflected a system of coerced labor, trafficking, and class exploitation. While Greek tradition emphasized seclusion and philosophical eroticism, and Roman society prized public morality and family legacy, both cultures relied on deeply entrenched sexual double standards that granted men a wide range of freedoms and punished women for the same. These ancient practices weren't just historical curiosities. They formed the bedrock of Western thinking about sex, gender, class, and power, the commodification of women and children. The policing of sexuality and the trafficking of bodies didn't end with the fall of the Roman Empire. They were rebranded, regulated, and reinvented across empires into the modern age. The legacy of the heterae, the concubina, the enslaved prostitute, and the silenced wife lives on in laws and cultural norms, and global structures of sex work and gendered labor that persist today. Imperial China had its own systemic hierarchy for concubinage, courtesans, and the politics of beauty. Imperial China institutionalized multiple forms of female service to elite men, concubinage, state-sponsored courtesans, and ritual entertainers, within a Confucian framework that regulated women's bodies as markers of status, loyalty, and moral order. There was a legal hierarchy from the Han Dynasty of 206 BCE to 220 CE onward. Wealthy men could maintain one wife, the zhenshi, and multiple concubines, qie, meaning concubine in Chinese. The imperial concubines were called pie. While concubines lacked the legal rights of wives, imperial households counted them among members eligible to produce heirs and participate in ancestor worship. The imperial harem, or the Hogong, mirrored this structure on a grand scale. Concubines were ranked from noble lady to virtuous lady, with precise rituals, allowance, and duties. Competition for imperial favor shaped palace politics and succession. Some concubines attained exceptional power. Wu Zetian, originally a concubine of Emperor Taizong, who reigned 626 to 649 CE, later seized the throne for herself, becoming China's only empress regnant. Imperial China also saw its fair share of government-sponsored courtesans and entertainers. Unlike concubines, these courtesans were trained in music, dance, poetry, to serve at official banquets and cultural events. From the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, the court maintained imperial music bureau troops, staffed by the Geji and the Yueji, singers and musicians who sometimes doubled as companions for high-ranking officials. Major cities, Hangzhou, Kaifeng, and Chang'an, hosted legalized pleasure districts where licensed courtesans peddled their art, paying taxes, and submitting to municipal oversight. Concubines were often drawn from aristocratic clans or tributary states to cement alliances. Their status could bolster a man's lineage and local influence. Practices like foot binding, which began in the 10th century, reinforced ideals of feminine beauty, submissiveness, and eligibility for concubinage or court service. Bound feet became a signifier of elite womanhood and domesticity. Neo-Confucian reforms from the Song Dynasty onward tightened women's physical mobility, confined them physically and socially to manage family honor. Yet, concubines and courtesans remained exceptions, precisely because their bodies served patriarchy and state interests. Official annuals during the last imperial dynasty of China detailed harem ranks, promotion, and scandal. The Ming legal codes had statutes defining penalties for concubine mistreatment and property rights. In imperial China, a man's wealth and rank were measured not only by land and treasury, but by the expansiveness of his household. While the legal wife, enshrined by Confucian law, guarded lineage, concubines competed in secret for power, producing heirs and influencing palace intrigue. Their bound feet and painted lips signified more than beauty. They were living tokens of political alliance. and patriarchy's control. Yet from these gilded cages emerged some of history's most formidable figures, reminding us that agency can flicker even in the shadows of an empire. I highly recommend watching a good sea drama. My first was The Double. I loved it. I'm also currently watching Perfect Match, so I was a little bit familiar with the concubine system vaguely, and clearly it's, dramatized historical fiction, but I love it. Imperial Japan, the floating world, courtesans, and politics of pleasure. Imperial Japan's ukiyo, or floating world, refers to the licensed pleasure quarters and theatrical districts that thrived under Tokugawa rule. Within this system, Oryan, high-ranking courtesans, and the geisha, professional entertainers, operated under strict hierarchies, their performances entwined with captivity, artistry, and social signaling. Originally a Buddhist term, meaning this sorrowful world, ukiyo, described life's impermanence and suffering. By the early 17th century, the characters were repurposed to mean the floating world, brothels, tea houses, and theaters. Established in Edo, modern Tokyo, in 1617, Yoshiwara was the shogun's sole licensed red light district, walled, gated, and regulated by the bokufu, or military government. The taiyu, which were top-ranked courtesans, to the yuzon, common prostitutes. The ukiyo-e, the woodblock prints that celebrated the floating world. Artists like Hiroshige and Utamaro depicted Oryan, geisha, and kabuki actors. Though censored at times, these images both fueled and reflected Yoshiwara's mystique. It housed hundreds, brothels, tea houses, and performance venues. Entry required fees, and patrons bought access to a meticulously tiered system of women. From the taiyu, or top-ranked courtesans, to the yuzon, or common prostitute. Elite courtesans were chosen for beauty, education, and their artistic skill and talent. Only a handful of the Oryan held the title at any given time. Their elaborate robes, towering hairpins, and reserved manner distinguished them from all others. Many entered Yoshiwara as children sold by impoverished families or indebted parents. Bound by long-term contracts, they served house masters until their debts were paid. Geisha were trained in dance, music, poetry, and conversation. Soldiers, merchants, and samurais sought them for cultural companionship, not strictly for sexual services. Geisha houses, ukiya, regulated training and employment. While the geisha could leave the profession, their financial ties to house mothers, okasan, often positioned them as de facto indentured servants. When diving into Japanese history, the Ritsuro system comes up endlessly, a legacy that started between the 7th and 10th century. Early codes categorized low-status people, yejin, often associated with servitude or hereditary bondage, as house slaves who could be bought and sold. They were not considered part of the four-tiered social hierarchy of nobles, warriors, farmers, and artisans. While some geijin were bought and sold, others might have had their own residences and families. They worked in various capacities, including as farm hands and domestic servants. Although formal slavery waned, debt bondage persisted until later Edo edicts. Girls, often orphans or debt-bound, signed contracts as shinzo, becoming indentured servants. Contracts frequently extended beyond repayment, trapping many in lifelong service. Authorities issued yuzhoncho, or prostitute licenses, and police yoshiwara to contain moral panic. Periodic reforms targeted excessive luxury among Oryan. From 1641 to 1853, only Nagasaki permitted regulated trade with China, the Netherlands, and occasionally Portugal. Chinese merchants and Dutch traders mingled with local elite and licensed brothels. Portuguese ships brought African crew and servants. Some Afro-Portuguese and Afro-Chinese women appear in 17th century Nagasaki records, working as intermediaries or courtesans. Nagasaki's red light quarters reflected a unique blend of Japanese, Chinese, European, and African influences, prefiguring modern global sex markets. And that, my friends, is just a taste. Edo's walled kingdom of desire, Yoshiwara, the heart of Japan's floating world. Kaiyu Oryan adorned themselves with towering shimadas and layered silks, their every gesture rehearsed as performance of status. Yet beyond the lacquer and perfume lay contracts as binding as any ransom. During Imperial Japan, female artistry and captivity were two sides of the same coin, a reminder that in the floating world, beauty was both currency and cage. Across the Islamic Caliphates and the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal courts of India, and the Moorish rule of the Iberian Peninsula, patriarchal and religious norms intertwined with political power to shape the roles of concubines, courtesans, and enslaved women. The Kayan, enslaved singing girls trained in poetry, music, and literary discourse. Though legally enslaved, many Kayan wielded significant cultural influence, hosting salons and advising patrons. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him's household included concubines, most famously Maria al-Qahtaniya. The Quran and Hadith regulate concubine treatment and offspring rights, granting children of concubines full legitimacy. The caliphs used concubinage to forge tribal alliances. Gifted women from subjugated peoples often became power brokers behind the throne. Within the Ottoman Empire from 14th to 19th century CE, the Topkapi Palace housed the Sultan's harem, a complex bureaucracy. Concubines, often of Circassian or Georgian origin, were educated in courtly arts, language, and etiquette. Senior concubines could become Valide Sultan, Queen Mother, exercising de facto regency. Harem Sultan, or Roxlana, wife of Suleiman the Great, 1520 to 1566, orchestrated state diplomacy and charitable patronage. Despite Quranic prohibitions on fornication, urban prostitution persisted. Licensed brothels existed in port cities, and as you can imagine, the enforcement of these licenses varied with local governors' discretion. Mughal India and British colonial rule, 16th to 19th century CE. Wives, elite courtesans in Lucknow and Delhi, trained in Kathak dance, Urdu, poetry, and classical music. They patronized poetic symposiums, musharas, and could influence nobles through performance. Mughal emperors maintained zananas, or women's quarters, with concubines drawn from Central Asia and India. Those sequestered, these women wielded soft power via palace entry. British Victorian morality clashed with the Tawaif culture, labeling it as immoral. Indentured servitude replaced slavery after 1833, but many courtesans fell into debt bondage under protection contracts with British officers. And of course, we cannot skip over Moorish rule of Iberia to 15th century CE. Andalusi courts mirrored Eastern models. Concubines and Qian performed music, poetry, and translated for Umayyad Emir Walada bin al-Mustakafi, a poetess and daughter of a caliphate, held her own literary salon in Cordoba. Under Muslim rule, concubinage was regulated by Islamic law. After the Christian Reconquista, enslaved and concubined women, often Muslim, Jewish, or sub-Saharan in origin, continued to serve in noble households. Andalusi women hosted majalis, or gatherings, where poetry and music flourished. Their cultural capital coexisted with vulnerability to expulsion and forced conversion after 1492. Religious texts provided guidelines for concubinage and enslavement, but enforcement varied widely. Courtesans could leverage their artistic skills into political influence and economic autonomy, even within oppressive systems. The abolition of the enslaved trade in the Ottoman and British context often gave way to debt bondage and indentured servitude, similar to post-Civil War Reconstruction in America. Ethnicity and lineage determine women's vulnerability and mobility. Caucasians in Istanbul, Central Asians in Delhi, and Amazigh women in Cordoba. In the courts of Baghdad, boys and girls of talented lineage sang for Caliphates, and Topkapi's hidden corridors. Georgian beauties rose to matriarchs of the realm. In Lucknow's moonlight salons, to wives penned verses that moved princes. Across the Islamic and Hindu worlds, women stood between devotion and desire, navigated systems that prized and punished their bodies. Their stories reveal not just the cruelty of the patriarchal trade of flesh, but the resilience of artistry amid captivity. Across Africa's diverse civilizations, over time, from the pharaohs of Egypt to the sultans of the Swahili coast and the emperors of West African empires, women's bodies were also woven into systems of alliance, artistry, and authority. Pharaonic Egypt and the Kingdom of Kush, 1350 BCE to 350 CE. Pharaohs maintained multiple wives and concubines. The great royal wife, like Nefertiti, wielded enormous influence. Lesser consorts bore children who could enter the line of succession. Royal women were often deified. Priestesses of Isis and Hathor combined religious office, courtly roles, ritual sexuality, sacred prostitution, sometimes framed as sacred service. While the institution of slavery existed, many concubines were tribute from Nubia or Canaan, trained in court etiquette and religion. Great Zimbabwe and southern kingdoms of 1100 to 1450 CE, and the Shona people of Great Zimbabwe's Polities, the Great Wife, managed court ceremonies and religious rituals. Junior wives and concubines supported the royal house. Marriages and concubinage forged ties between clans. Women's lineage determined matrilineal inheritance in some Zimbabwean chiefdoms, giving senior wives significant sway over succession. In the Mali Empire and Sahelian courts of 1235 to 1600 CE, emperors like Mansa Musa had numerous wives and concubines drawn from across West Africa and Berber regions, cementing trade and diplomatic networks. Women served as griots, or oral historians, and praise singers. Some also acted as griots, courtesans who performed at court, blending artistry with patronage. Rebellious queens and princesses, like Nyana Manjani, leveraged their positions to negotiate peace or lead armies. The Songhai Empire and House of City-States ruled after the fall. The Songhai Empire and House of City-States of 1464-1591 CE was a powerful West African empire that rose to prominence after the fall of Mali. Songhai sultans maintained harems in Gao. Concubines were selected for their lineage and skills in diplomacy. In Keno and Zaria, the Magajaya, or senior wife, and subordinate Yan Matamu, or concubines, supported palace protocol. Some amassed wealth through trade. The Oyo Empire was one of the most politically important states in Western Africa from the late 16th century to the early 18th century, located in present-day southwest Nigeria. It reached its peak in the 17th and 18th century, dominating a large area of Yorubaland and influencing neighboring states like the Fon Kingdom of Dahomey. The Oyo Empire was known for its strong cavalry, its role in regional trade, and complex political institutions. In the Oyo Empire, Oba was the term for king or ruler. The Oba held supreme authority within the empire, making policy decisions, settling disputes, and controlling the empire's administration. The Oba was considered to be a sacred ruler, and his authority was often linked to divine origins, particularly through his connection to the god Shango. The Oba's principal wife and official concubines lived in the palace performing ritual rites. Certain female society members performed secret rites and occasionally served as palace concubines, blurring sacred and erotic services. Dahomey and the Benin kingdoms of 1600 to 1894 CE, the Ahosi or Dahomey Amazons. Though formally sworn to celibacy, they lived within the palace walls and enjoyed a degree of autonomy, and were considered wives of the king, and some served informally as direct companions to the king. The women warriors served as the king's bodyguards and fought in battles alongside male soldiers. They were rigorously trained in combat, weaponry, survival skills, often exhibiting exceptional bravery, In Benin, the Ioba, or Queen Mother, held formal power, while lesser wives and concubines reinforced court alliances across Edo sub-chiefdoms. Like many of the civilizations that we've already covered across the globe so far, the women of these African empires were used as diplomatic tokens. Their marriages and concubinage forged trade and military alliances. Griots, priestesses, and courtesans combined performance and influence, yet often under restricted contract or debt bondage. Y'all seen a pattern here? Indigenous beliefs like ancestor worship and Orisha cults and Islamic codes in Sahelian states framed women's rights and status. From griot poets to warrior queens, African women negotiated power within the same patriarchal structures, much like their female counterparts across oceans, over pyramids, mountains, ruins, and valleys. So far in this episode, we have traced the global presence of courtesans, concubines, and enslaved women, wielding their influence, enduring violence, being played like pawns in politics, and performing femininity. Across empires and centuries, we've seen how the commodification of women's bodies was never just about sex. It was about control, lineage, labor, aesthetics, and empire building. It was about inheritance, religion, caste, class, and spectacle. And it was always, always about power. But this is only half of the global stage. In part 2, we move forward into Renaissance Europe, where, quote, honest courtesans and salon intellectuals obscured the boundaries between decency and defiance. We'll unravel the racialized sexual economies of colonialism, where concubinage often masked systemic violence, and where enslaved Black women were forced into roles as mistresses, wet nurses, and commodities. We'll explore how race, gender, and desire were manipulated and marketed to build colonial wealth, and how American white women were both oppressed and complicit, much like they are in present day. Finally, we'll look at the transitions of the 18th to 20th centuries in the Western world, where the elaborately decorated ballrooms and salons gave way to stages and the silver screen. How the courtesan became the celebrity, only to be rebranded once again in our era as the IG baddie, the influencer, the sugar baby, the yacht girl, dominating apps with algorithmic intimacy. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below. Feel free to share an empire or age you'd love to hear more about in a future episode. I'll see you in part 2, Down the Demimonde.